You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, James Copnell. Less than 2 weeks ago, President Trump tested positive for the coronavirus. Now he's back on the campaign trail. His first stop, an election rally in Florida, where he appeared energetic as he told the crowd about his experience of the virus.
I went through it. Now they say I'm immune. I feel so powerful. I'll walk into that audience. I'll walk in there. I'll kiss everyone in that audience. I'll kiss the guys and the beautiful women and everybody. I'll just give you a big fat kiss. No, but there is something nice. I don't have to be locked up in my basement, and I wouldn't allow that to happen anyway. I wouldn't allow it to happen. When you're the president, you can't lock yourself in a basement and say, I'm not going to bother with the world. You got to get out, and it's risky. It's risky, but you got to get out.
The rally took place on the tarmac of Orlando's Sanford Airport, the open-air nature of the event a concession to the coronavirus pandemic and the understanding that the virus spreads less easily amongst people when they're outdoors. In the days leading up to the rally, the president's doctor repeatedly avoided answering questions about whether President Trump had tested negative for COVID-19. But shortly before his boss took to the stage, Dr. Sean Conley released a memo saying the president had indeed tested negative on consecutive days, end quote, although he didn't provide an exact timeline. We're joined in the studio by the BBC's Gareth Barlow. And Gareth, President Trump offering bravado and a surprising amount of energy.
Yes, anybody who thought him contracting COVID-19, being hospitalised, being given a cocktail of drugs would lead to a muted President Trump was very much wrong. He was bullish, he was biting, at times he was even bellicose. He was his very true self. And we saw him throw some face masks into the crowd, then saying that he was so healthy, he wanted, like we heard, to go in and kiss them. He said he was young and in perfect shape. Well, he's 74 and clinically obese. He said he was now immune, but experts say that cannot be proven and can't be accurately claimed. He then went on to chide the Democrats, called them crazy. He attacked, as he calls him, sleepy Joe Biden, criticised his rallies. He was his true self, his honest self, his very real and normal self, I think it's fair to say.
You mentioned masks, but there didn't appear to be too much social distancing happening at the venue.
There is an image online that will surely send shudders through the spines of scientists. It shows thousands of his supporters all gathered beneath Stars and Stripes banners that are hanging from cranes. You've got Air Force One in the background. Some face masks, some of them even thrown by the president himself. But there is barely enough room to swing a MAGA cap. People are bunched together. No evident physical distancing at play. And this is in a state that has so far seen 15,000 deaths. And if we think back to the last big set-piece event, Donald Trump's so-called super spreader event, as it's become known, that event in the Rose Garden of the White House where he unveiled Amy Coney Barrett as his Supreme Court nominee. That was the time that both he and his wife contracted the coronavirus, at least a dozen other known cases, including 2 senators, although Mike Lee of Utah back in the Senate today to listen to those Supreme Court nomination hearings. So there were real concerns that the same might happen again because the pandemic hasn't gone away. At least 214,000 deaths in the United States, 7.8 million cases, and both figures still rising.
And while President Trump is in Florida, his opponent Joe Biden has been speaking in the Midwestern state of Ohio, and where he continued to focus on the president's handling of the pandemic.
That's Donald Trump's presidency. 215,000 dead because of COVID. Experts say we're likely to lose another 200,000 people in the next few months unless we take some serious action, and he doesn't know what he's doing. All because this president's only worried about one thing, the stock market. He refuses to follow the science. It's estimated that if we just wore these masks nationally, we'd save over 100,000 lives between now and the end of the year.
So that's Joe Biden, and then both the presidential candidates then on the road campaigning in the so-called swing states.
Yes, these swing states, the dozen or so in this election, are the ones that will decide the outcome, because there is a substantial tranche of states whose outcome and prediction and allegiance you could predict with your eyes closed and your fingers in your ears. They are doggedly loyal to either the Democrats or the Republicans, but these swing states are crucial. Donald Trump is visiting 4 in 4 days, and politically, he does really need to be out and about. He is lagging in the polls. He's at risk of becoming the first single-term president since George Bush Sr. in 1989 to 1993. Florida, one of these key swing states, it's Donald Trump's home state, but he's lagging behind Joe Biden. And Joe Biden is benefiting from that huge $100 million advertising campaign being funded by the former presidential nominee for the Democrats, or the potential nominee for the Democrats, Mike Bloomberg. And so as long as there is this election to win, President Trump will be on the road trying to win it. And as long as he does so through these large rallies, people will be questioning whether he's right to do so.
Gareth Barlow, thank you. Well, Mr. Trump says he's now immune to COVID-19, as you heard, something the scientists have quickly criticised. And in fact, the United States has just reported its first confirmed case of coronavirus reinfection. The 25-year-old man, who has no underlying health conditions, suffered worse symptoms the second time round. Reinfections remain extremely rare, but the case raises questions about how much immunity can be built up against the virus. The newsroom's Charlotte Gallagher has been speaking to our health correspondent, James Gallagher, and we perhaps should say they're not related. First, here's James Gallagher.
The thing we know for sure is that reinfections are seemingly very rare because there have been more than 37 million people that have tested positive for coronavirus, and there's been a handful of cases of reinfections that have been documented. But this is one of them. So this is a man that caught the virus in March, developed symptoms like a cough, then recovered, was completely fine in April, tested negative multiple times in May. But then at the very end of the month and into June, he got sick again. And curiously, he got even more sick than the first time around and actually needed hospital treatment and to be given oxygen this time.
So is that worrying that he got sicker the second time after he contracted it?
There's two things that are worrying about this particular case. One is the short period of time. People anticipate that, protection or immunity will wane over time, but they weren't thinking it would happen over the course of 6 or so weeks, which is the timescale of this case. But also, yes, the fact that it was more severe is worrying. The reassuring thing is that, again, this is still seemingly quite rare, but we're still only the beginnings of understanding really what immunity to coronavirus looks like and properly understanding the relationship between our immune system and the coronavirus.
Because lots of people, including President Trump, believe that once they've had it, they're immune, and that seems to be quite a common misconception.
Yeah, so this is a cast iron guaranteed case of someone who has caught the virus twice. The difficulty is that we don't know how common this is. It appears to be rare, but it may become more common over time as immunity probably wanes the longer you leave it in between two infections. So one of the big questions, though, is what does it mean when you catch it the second time? Because it might be okay in the sense for you that you don't get as severely ill. That is what most people expect. This case might be quite unusual. Most people expect future cases of coronavirus to be milder. But that doesn't mean that you haven't been infected, the virus isn't in your body, and that you're still able to spread it. And really understanding what happens in a second infection of coronavirus is going to be so important going into the future in terms of understanding how this virus is going to spread throughout the population.
I guess that's one of the hardest things with this, is that it is so new. So doctors are learning as they go along.
Yeah, totally. And if you think about it, this virus emerged in China at the very end of 2019. We're, 3/4 of the way through 2020. We've not even had a full year with this virus. And when you talk about long-term immunity to an infection, you're not talking about a couple of months. You're talking about what happens 5-10 years down the line. And so we really don't have any long-term evidence around coronavirus. We're all still in a massive global experiment, really, trying to figure out what on earth is going on. And I think one of the hardest things around coronavirus, both as a member of the general public and as a journalist, is acknowledging the huge amount of uncertainty that there is around nearly every facet of this virus.
James Gallagher. A judge investigating one of the worst massacres in El Salvador's civil war has accused the government of blocking access to crucial military files. Nearly 1,000 people were murdered in the village of El Mozote in 1981, accused of collaborating with left-wing rebels. Hundreds of children were among the victims. Our Latin America regional editor, Leonardo Rocha, told me more about the incident and the subsequent investigation.
It was the worst massacre in the El Salvador Civil War that went on for 12 years. The details are gruesome. It's an awful story. What happened is this battalion This group of soldiers were trained in the United States and then went to fight in the El Salvador Civil War. They just rounded up the village and they stayed in that village for 3 days. They tortured, they raped, and they killed everyone who was there. Very poor people. They were subjected to torture as well to try to confess the fact that they would be contributing, collaborating with the left-wing guerrillas. So that was awful. It was more or less in the beginning of the Civil War, and we still haven't had justice for that, and the families have been campaigning.
The judge then says the government is blocking his investigation, perhaps the army too. Why?
Well, it's interesting because President Nayib Bukele said that he was going to collaborate, but what the accusation against him here is that he's playing a double game. What you have here is many people who were very senior at the time, who had involvement with the American government. They received aid, they received money. They probably don't want that to come out in the open. So there was a ceasefire and a peace deal in the early 90s, and they say, well, it's all done, and the massacres from both sides. That's more or less what you have across Latin America. You have an amnesty and you just move on, which is convenient for the people who are in power. So I think that is the allegation. This judge has been trying to have access to the building, to the barracks where these archives are. And a month ago, the president said, well, you can have access, but then he said a few hours later, look, but I think all the documents have been destroyed a long time ago. And this judge tried to get into the barracks. He wasn't allowed in theory because there was secrets of state there. And again yesterday, and he will try again and again.
Latin America regional editor Leonardo Rocha. You're listening to the BBC World Service, and Neil has the headlines.
President Trump has held his first election rally since he was diagnosed with COVID-19, giving an energetic hour-long speech to supporters in Florida. Doctors say a man in the U.S. has caught the coronavirus twice, with the second infection more serious than the first. And the authorities in Peru have reopened the Inca ruins at Machu Picchu for a single Japanese tourist who's been stranded in the country since March.
Now, if you go onto the website for the United Nations Human Rights Council, it describes its role as the promotion and protection of all human rights around the globe. It's made up of 47 states, and there are going to be some new additions today. But campaign groups are unhappy that these potential new members, as rumour has it, include China, Russia and Saudi Arabia. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale.
The United Nations Human Rights Council was established to promote and protect human rights. Its 47 members are supposed to uphold the highest standards in this regard. And yet today, UN members are expected to elect China, Russia and Saudi Arabia onto the Council. This despite criticism of Beijing over the treatment of ethnic minorities, Moscow over the poisoning of critics, and Riyadh over the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Several human rights groups have called on UN members to think again. One, UN Watch, said it was like making a gang of arsonists responsible for the fire brigade. In the UK, the Labour Party has urged the government to oppose China's candidacy in particular. The Foreign and Development Office said it would not turn a blind eye to human rights abuses in Xinjiang. If these three countries are elected, diplomats hope to use the Council as a forum to call out their abuses, but the risk is these countries use their membership to avoid further scrutiny.
James Landau. There have been deadly clashes between the Nigerian police and protesters demanding an end to police brutality in the country's commercial hub, Lagos. For about a week, activists and young people have been protesting against brutality by personnel of a notorious police unit widely accused of extortion, torture and extrajudicial killings. The authorities had announced on Sunday that the police unit, known as Special Anti-Robbery Squad or SARS, has been disbanded, but said its officers would be redeployed, and so the protests have continued. The BBC's Isaac Khalid reports from Abuja.
Eyewitnesses say there were multiple casualties among protesters after police opened fire on them in Surulere area of Lagos on Monday. Some of the demonstrators reportedly threw stones at the police. The police say one officer was killed and two others were critically injured by what they called armed protesters. A man in the area told the BBC his driver, who was not a protester, was shot. He said they got stuck in a traffic jam and the driver alighted to urinate but was hit by a bullet. The police in Lagos and the protesters blame each other for the death of the 55-year-old man. An aide to President Muhammadu Buhari has condemned the use of live bullets on demonstrators by the police. There are reports that armed trucks have been deployed to Lagos Airport to break up protests blocking access to the airport. Earlier, the president promised what he called extensive police reforms and said that SARS officers responsible for human rights violations would be brought to justice. But the latest alleged use of live bullets by the police on protesters could further anger campaigners and lend more credence to their grievances.
The coronavirus has had a huge impact on religious gatherings, and in Portugal, the last major celebrations of the year at the Roman Catholic shrine of Fatima are taking place with strict social distancing measures in place. Just a few thousand pilgrims were dotted around the complex on Monday night, rather than the tens or even hundreds of thousands in the traditional candlelight procession, as Alison Roberts reports.
O pão nosso de cada dia nos dai hoje, perdoai-nos as nossas ofensas, assim como nós perdoamos.
Fatima presented a strikingly different picture at the start of this, the year's last international pilgrimage, from last month's celebrations. Then, tens of thousands flooded the shrine, making physical distancing all but impossible. This time, the far fewer pilgrims allowed into the shrine were asked to stay within circles painted on the ground, one for each social bubble, even as the image of the Virgin Mary was carried past their flickering candles. For the year's first international pilgrimage, the shrine admitted no visitors, instead streaming celebrations online. August saw the first organised foreign groups, but in September there was an unexpectedly large influx of pilgrims, alarming the health authorities. So these services are limited to just 6,000 people. Meanwhile, a slump in revenues at the shrine has prompted it to cut 50 jobs. That comes after several very lucrative years in Fatima, with millions visiting for the centenary of the Visions of the Virgin reported by 3 children back in 1917.
Alison Roberts. Neil has some other stories from our news desk.
An official investigation into the handling of one of Europe's first coronavirus outbreaks at 2 Austrian ski resorts has said there were momentous miscalculations by the authorities. More than 6,000 tourists from several countries say they were infected in the area, which has been blamed for spreading the disease around Europe. The largest ever science expedition to the Arctic has completed its journey, with the Polar Stern research vessel arriving back to its home port in Germany. The ship spent a year in the polar north, drifting with the sea ice to study the changing Arctic climate. Researchers said ice sheets had completely disappeared, even at the North Pole. And Facebook has made a donation of more than $1.3 million to Bletchley Park in the UK, known as the birthplace of modern computing. The technology giant said the donation was to support Bletchley's work for the next 2 years after it had suffered badly because of the coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you, Neil. Now let's get the latest sports news with James Gregg.
Thank you very much. LeBron James says ending the LA Lakers' decade-long wait for an NBA title is among the greatest accomplishments of his career, especially coming during the coronavirus pandemic. The Lakers beat the Miami Heat to seal a 4-2 series victory, and LeBron posted a triple-double. He scored 28 points, 14 rebounds and 10 assists. And he says it was tough to live within the biosecure bubble, but in the end, it was well worth it.
I think you wouldn't be human if you didn't have ups and downs in the bubble. Times I was questioning myself, should I be here? Is this worth sacrificing my family? I've never been without my family this long, and missing the days of my daughter being in kindergarten, even though it's through Zoom. It's her first year of kindergarten. Missing my son's 16th birthday, which we all know is a big birthday if you have kids. So absolutely, I've had ups and downs throughout this whole journey. But for some odd reason, I was able to keep the main thing. And all the stuff that I talked about that I missed, they understood that too. So it made it a lot easier for me. This is right up there with one of the greatest accomplishments I had.
Elsewhere, plans for radical reforms of English football, which are known as Project Big Picture, have continued to split opinion. A source at West Ham United has told the BBC that they're very much against the plans, which are being led by Liverpool and Manchester United, to see the English top flight cut to 18 teams. Other parts of the proposal would see parachute payments scrapped, while the English Football League would see a £250 million rescue fund made immediately available. And the National League Championship in baseball series between the LA Dodgers and Atlanta Braves is being held in Texas, and it's been staged among more relaxed laws around holding larger events with crowds, and so up to 11,500 supporters have been able to watch the game between the Atlanta Braves and the LA Dodgers. And for more sport from the BBC, you can go to bbc.com/sport.
Polish Navy divers have begun a delicate operation to defuse a huge unexploded bomb which was dropped by the British Royal Air Force during an attack on a German warship in 1945. The bomb, called a tall boy, is lying on the bottom of a shipping canal near Świnoujście on the Baltic Sea. As our correspondent Adam Easton reports from Warsaw, the operation has its challenges.
Tall boy bombs have been defused before, but only on land, never underwater. The bomb is lying 12 metres down on the bottom of the busy shipping canal. Defusing it will be difficult. A controlled explosion is too dangerous because it would cause a massive seismic shock that could damage property far away. Instead, the bomb's charge will be removed by a remotely controlled device after days of painstaking preparations by Navy divers. Hundreds of nearby residents have been evacuated, but some have refused to go to a temporary shelter in a sports hall for fear they could catch the coronavirus.
Adam Easton. English Pen, which promotes free speech around the world, has given its 2020 award for International Writer of Courage to the Eritrean poet Emmanuel Asrat. Asrat, who also worked as a journalist, was arrested 19 years ago in a campaign by the government of Eritrea to stifle critical voices. Our arts correspondent Vincent Dowd reports.
Abasa ኩናት ሓደ ነገር ጓዚሙ ሓደ ነገር ተዳሂዩ.
A poem by Emmanuel Asrat was read out in Monday's online ceremony organised by English Pen. He was arrested, along with others, in September 2001. What's happened in the years since to him and to most of those arrested is not clear. He's thought still to be in prison, though it's impossible to be sure, as Eritrea is a repressive one-party state with no free media whatsoever. Emmanuel Asrat had also been editor of the newspaper Zemen, one of several publications forced to close in a crackdown on free speech. His brother Daniel, speaking by video link, said the family was pleased to see the world reminded of Emmanuel's cause.
You can imagine how painful it is for parents to lack information about whereabouts of their child for 19 years and counting. I wish Emmanuel could somehow be aware of this tremendous honor and recognition. This award will also serve to uplift the spirit of our family.
The International Writer of Courage Award is given each year on the recommendation of the winner of the Pinter Prize, who this year is the Jamaican-born British poet Linton Kwesi Johnson.
Our arts correspondent Vincent Dowd there. Before we go, a reminder that you can download our latest global news podcast at bbcworldservice.com. But for this edition of The Newsroom, and from me, goodbye.